Thank you so much for including our paper in the program. This is joint work with Feng and Yaping, and they're both in the audience. As you know, we're increasingly relying on big data to predict things, right? So now you can use social media feeds to kind of predict customer demand for certain products, ensure that you never run out. Mobile app data give us clues about how comfortable we now feel about COVID, and that in turn helps us gauge where the economy is headed. So it shouldn't come as a surprise that investors also are increasingly relying on big data to predict how companies and the overall stock market are going to do. And so what we wanted to do in this paper is tackle two questions that we think are quite basic and fundamental. We wanted to know how widely are actually big data, alternative data used by financial firms, and if so, in what form? And also, is it actually helpful? Does it help improve their forecasting performance? Now, while these questions are basic, they're actually quite challenging to tackle empirically. Like, we rarely know when people actually use alternative data, in what form. And then it's also hard to measure actually the performance implications. So to tackle these challenges, we look at a setting that we think at least partially helps with these. We look to sell-side analysts. So these are professionals trying to predict a company's earnings and overall how the company is doing. And they write these analyst reports where they detail their forecasts and also explain a little bit how they arrived at those forecasts. And so what we noticed is that a lot of them actually explicitly reference the use of alternative data. So for instance, here you have a report by UBS on Walt Disney, and they're saying it's actually quite important to get a sense of how well Shanghai Disneyland is doing to Walt Disney's overall performance. The challenge is that there's very little information on how well that theme park is doing. And so what do the analysts do? They rely on mobile app data and also satellite images to get a sense of how well this company is doing. And in this particular case, they're suggesting this theme park is rocking, Walt Disney is going to do well. Okay. So this is kind of what we're going to do, is we're going to look at all these analyst reports and see whether they explicitly reference the use of alternative data. That'll then help us infer how widely used are alternative data and in what form. And what we then also can do is we can compare the analysts that use or draw from alternative data and see whether the earnings forecasts that they come up with are more accurate than the earnings forecasts of analysts that do not explicitly draw from alternative data. And so this is kind of what we do in this paper. And what we find is that alternative data are widely used, put widely in quotation marks. I guess it's a little bit subjective, but we think it's widely used. And it does seem to help analysts form more accurate forecasts. And in essence, I mean, I could almost stop here. That's kind of our paper. But maybe I provide a little bit more detail. So here's our data. So we started this project 2019, and because, as you'll see in a bit, it's quite labor intensive to go through these analyst reports, we decided on 10 years. So we went back 10 years, seemed like a good number. And we're looking at firms that are part of the Dow Jones Index. So there's about 35 firms, 70,000 analyst reports, and we're able to match more than 90% of them with data from IBIS, CRISP, and CompuStat. That's our data. Our dependent variable is straight from the literature. It's a measure of earnings forecast accuracy. So for each analyst and firm and earnings, we see what is the forecast, what is the actual earnings, and how far is the forecast from the actual earnings. Now, of course, a large value is bad. So to make it a measure of accuracy, we multiply by -1. The more interesting variable is whether this forecast is actually supported by alternative data. Now, there's still 64,000 analyst reports, and we didn't want to read all of them. So what we did instead was the following. So we got a list of 519 in-house data science teams and alternative data vendors. And so in our first step, what we do is we check whether in any of these analyst reports, they explicitly reference these alternative data vendors, the names. Just to give you an example, one of the big alternative data vendors is RS Metrics, right? So we parse all these 64,000 analyst reports and see how often does this term appear in those reports. And there's 47 of such reports. And so here's one of those. What we then do in our second step is we read all of those that we find through this first round. And we look for keywords that the analysts use to describe the alternative data, like satellite images and parking lot fill rates. And then in our second step, what we do is then we now search for those keywords, like we parse again all 64,000 analyst reports and look for those keywords. And then we find more analyst reports that make use of these terms, but do not explicitly reference an alternative data vendor, okay, and so forth. And that's how we find analyst reports that explicitly draw from alternative data. We again carefully read them to eliminate false positives. Sometimes they use terms like satellite image, not because they rely on alternative data, but to describe a company's products. And so then this is what we find. So these are all analyst forecasts that we find are backed up by a report that explicitly references alternative data. And here are forecasts where we didn't find anything, at least per our keyword search. And so what you see is at the beginning of our sample, about 6% of the forecasts are backed up with reports that explicitly reference the use of alternative data. And this is something that's been going up, that fraction. We differentiate a little bit by alternative data categories. Okay? And so we find the most frequently referenced category is actually web traffic. So this tells you kind of like what are some of the terms people search for in the internet, how long do people spend on certain websites. So this is the kind of data that analysts draw from the most frequently. To us, a little bit surprisingly, satellite image data, not so much. Like it actually happens very rarely. At the same time, we find that within the first year of our sample period, so 2009, 2010, we find analyst reports drawing from alternative data from all of these 8 categories. Right? I think what this tells us is that alternative data, big data, has been used by analysts for a really, really long time in various forms already. I mean, I think if we expanded our sample period and went back even further in time, like 2004, I wouldn't be surprised if we even find analyst reports around that time drawing from alternative data. So how beneficial is the use of alternative data? This is kind of the regression we run, forecast accuracy on an indicator variable that tells us whether the analyst explicitly draws from alternative data. We throw in various fixed effects, analyst firm fixed effects, Fermi fixed effects, and a bunch of controls. And the way we would like to interpret the coefficient that comes out of that is almost like in a quasi-diff and diff setting. It's not a true diff and diff setting, right? Because it's not like there's this exogenous shock that causes analysts to all of a sudden draw from alternative data, right? They choose to. We think it's still sort of a quasi-diff and diff in the sense that the way we interpret this estimate is how much does my forecast accuracy change once I start using alternative data, okay, compared with peers who cover the same firm, same earnings, but do not rely on alternative data, right? In that sense, it's still a diff and diff. How much does my forecast accuracy change? And how does it compare to the forecast accuracy change of my peers for the same firm, same earnings that do not rely on alternative data? And so this is what we find. There's a super strong positive estimate suggesting that once analysts adopt alternative data, the forecasts become more accurate. Like, to give you a sense of the economic significance, you can compare this estimate with the estimate for various control variables reported in prior literature. And so not surprisingly, what prior literature finds is that the longer a firm has been covering a firm, the more accurate the forecasts become. And so when you compare our estimate with that of prior literature and also in our regression, The estimate suggests that using alternative data improves your accuracy by as much as 3.7 additional years of having covered a firm. And we can also see which category is the most helpful. And so when you, when you look a little bit at the estimates, it's like the size of the estimate, like app usage seems to improve accuracy the most. A geospatial and satellite images, not so much. And as you might recall, these are also the two categories least frequently used by analysts. More to this, like EY at one point conducted a survey among hedge fund managers asking them, of the alternative data you've been using, which one's the least accurate? And they also report geolocation and satellite. And so we kind of find this agreement between this survey and our findings kind of interesting. We find that this effect grows with the longer or the analyst has been applying alternative data. It becomes stronger when the analyst has local colleagues also using alternative data. So our take on this is that there's some kind of learning from your one's own experience and from peers. Here we actually lean quite heavily on work by our discussant, Jill, and we wanted to see whether the use of alternative data comes with changes in other things like timeliness of forecasts, earnings conference call behavior. The reason we looked at this is that we were quite concerned, and to some degree we're still a little bit concerned that there's some kind of endogeneity, right? Analysts choose to use alternative data. So we're a little bit wondering whether what triggered their choice is what's actually responsible for the improved forecast accuracy. We can't rule it out. At the same time, we also don't find much change in those in all the other things we looked at. The last thing I wanted to cover is, so we then also look at how do investors react to analysts that rely on alternative data. And there's a large literature that finds evidence that investors do pay attention to analysts, their forecasts, and trade on it, and that this affects stock prices. So here we assess whether investors listen more to analysts that explicitly draw from alternative data versus, I guess, the more traditional analysts. And so here's the regression we run is we look at stock price changes around when analysts change their earnings forecast, their target price forecast, and recommendations. And what you see, and this is in line with prior literature, when analysts do update their earnings forecast, say by 10%, the stock price around that time also goes up, here around 0.4%. The new finding here is that when analysts actually change their earnings forecast and draw from alternative data, that same forecast change leads to a much, or is associated with a much stronger stock market response, okay? 3 times as much. And we observe similar things for target price changes and recommendation changes. And so in a nutshell, that's our paper. We find evidence that analysts explicitly draw from alternative data. And when they decide to do, their earnings forecasts improve, and investors respond accordingly. That's kind of our paper.
Okay, thank you very much. Next, we have Jill Grennan, the discussant. You have the floor.
Cool. Well, thank you. It was great to come back and to be able to read a paper that was fascinating to me because I've thought a lot about the alt data space from, looking at it myself to actually analyzing it in other contexts. So it's a really cool paper. I really love what they were doing. We live in an era of data abundance, yet deriving meaningful insights is often challenging, given the uncertain quality, given the volume. So they're asking if analysts, people traditionally tasked with prediction work, how useful is this data abundance? The data work that they did matching investor text to IBIS, like that is time consuming. So I appreciate that they made the crosswalk. And then there's an important finding. So they find that analysts have been using alt data since 2009. Its use is associated with short-term accuracy, especially in revenue predictions. And interestingly, the market seems to not have this info ahead of time. I really enjoyed reading it, and so I'm going to focus sort of about putting it in context, especially since this is a conference on the future of financial information, what I think are the adoption forces and sort of the short versus long run. And then ultimately for the empirics, I'm going to really focus on the interpretation and, encourage the authors to explore the richness of their data. I mean, it is really cool that they have the different categories. I think we can all agree that there's investors that are using this. They're using all different sources to try and predict what's going to happen with earnings, what's going to happen with stock prices, all of that. And the data abundance, if you don't believe it, this is one of zettabytes. I can't remember exactly where I pulled it from per year. This is 2010 over to predicted for 2024, just how sharply it's going to grow. And then I always like to put this in my presentation, the 2020 every minute in a day. That, there's 208,000 new Zoom hosts in a single minute, 41 million WhatsApp messages are sent in a single minute. So there's just so much to process. You really, I often argue you can't do it without AI. And then sort of what else is going on in this space is that we had this massive computational ease. And so if you look at sort of I pulled this from OpenAI. 2012 is what they sort of mark as like the next era, but just how much the curve of how we were changing has went up. It's, the modern era is just growing at more than what, we would think of as Moore's Law. So here Moore's Law was doubling every 2 years. Here they say Moore's Law is doubling every 3 months. So just the rapid pace of improvement. And then this one, I pulled this from Dan Rock's paper. If you guys haven't seen it, I really love this. So the graph's not perfect, but what he looks at is when Google made the decision to make TensorFlow open source, and they had never really made any of their AI stuff or open source before. And this is the number of LinkedIn, because he has the actual LinkedIn, he won the graph challenge or whatever, just how many more people add. It's like, 1,000x more people adding deep learning skills like in the months right after it went open source. And so I put these all together, and this is based on many conversations I've had of what is influencing sort of this fintech, AI, big data, all of it is leading to this boom in finance. And so I think they're really focusing on this one sort of basic data abundance, but I think you can't, ignore that it's all interacting with other parts. So you also have computational ease. You have the fact that it's easier to train models for stable results. You have data integrity, which I think is more recently becoming a lot of, I heard people obviously talking about filling with zeros. I've heard this a lot from some of the hedge funds that I've talked to about, how they're ensuring that garbage in, garbage out is limited. Competition, it's not just the analysts that have access to this. You have so much competition from outside that, the incumbents can't afford not to keep up. And then this sort of accessible talent that basically by making it open source, you have all these people who can train themselves. And so now we have a workforce that basically has a modular system that then they can go use the same tools elsewhere. It's not company specific. You're not trapped in IBM for your whole career. Okay. So now let me, with that context, go into their key findings, and sort of, I'm going to rearrange the order of the paper. I probably would if it was me, but it's them. So I'll do it the way I found it most striking. So they first document this use of alt data. In 2009, they're like 11% of analysts used it. This is doubled over their sample. They claim it's surprising. And there's one thing is like, they're being very specific in their definition. I've actually looked at these reports myself. I had an RA go through the source because I had an idea for a little bit related to what they're doing, was looking at the source because they have to list it under all their figures. But this is my paper with Ronnie on fintechs in the market for financial analysts. And one of the categories of fintechs we look at is those that data mine for financial signals. At the time, this paper has data from like 2009 to 2017. We had 166 of them, but they were definitely going towards both retail and institutional investors. And the mean founding year, so this is mean, is 2007. So I totally agree with what you were saying that, by 2009, people are certainly using this. Okay, so I didn't find it as surprising, but if you wanted that to see that. What I am going to say, and what sort of ends up getting surprising to me, is, so does big data improve price informativeness? And so this is an interesting theory question. It's an interesting empirical question. And I really like the theory work. I'm going to butcher their names, so I won't say it, but they have these nice theories about data abundance and how they work. And so what they're trying to understand is the effect is really driven by this signal to noise ratio, and the fact that data abundance basically makes it less costly to find low quality signals, but it also makes it much more costly given the noise to find high quality signals. And so sort of it's the classic, needle in the haystack problem. And so what does this really mean? And they predict that, we're going to sort of basically get this imbalance in the short term versus the long term equilibrium. And I'm going to return to this point throughout my talk. So what do we see? So in our paper where we're looking at these fintechs, we focused on some crowd wisdom data. It's a type of alt data. We find it improves price informativeness. But consistent with sort of their theory, we document a lot higher cost of trying to find high quality signals. Essentially, you need AI to be able to do it. And what we then do, though, is the last table in the paper, it was actually part of the refereeing process, that what we looked at was forecasts were revealed in these same stocks that had high alt data. It seemed that the information content was lower. Okay, so this is where I'm going to then go into your result, where you find what I think is this key awesome finding. It's actually the opposite. You find that the analysts that use alt data in their forecasts have these higher CARs. And it's meaningfully higher CARs, like across it. Like we saw this, like depending on how you looked at it, you showed this 3x, 2x different categories. It's there, it's certainly there. And so this was like the little puzzle to me, and is sort of where I'm going to go at with the framing. I think it's a cool finding. I think it's new in the literature. I haven't seen this before. Okay, and so this leads me to the interpretation of treatment versus selection. As you were saying, analysts choose to use alt data. Thus, even with your tight, and I admit you have tight fixed effects, it's not random because it's potentially correlated with this effort. I choose, even with the same stock in this particular quarter, to make more effort, and you can't control for that. This means that it's not really a treatment effect, because you're not really saying, oh, if I randomly gave some analyst alt data, what would happen? That's not what's happening. Instead, the key to your interpretation is this selection effect. The analysts that are going after alt data for a particular stock, they're going after it when it's very valuable, and they are realizing returns from this. This is awesome. This is super interesting to me. They are smart. They know when to go after it. I want to know more. I want to know when and why. I want to know those facts that you have in this richness of your data. So I would love you to explore this. The authors have many types of data, as they showed, app usage, satellite images. So, when does this alt data, why are the analysts going after it? Is it a time when there's higher low price efficiency in the stock? Who are the traders mainly on that stock? Is it when there's less high frequency traders in it? Is it when there's fewer hedge funds, more passive owners? I'd love to know sort of those type of things. But also, why is the market not smarter given all the tools that are out there? And so since you have that long time series, I would just love to see is it going, this is my short term versus long term, is it fading over time, or is it actually they've gotten even better because they understand, because you had that learning effect too. I would love to know just the time. I think either way it could be interesting, because it could be now they're trusting alt data more or something like that. And then I think this is your key finding 3. I actually like this one. The alt data generates winners and losers. So not all analysts benefit the same way. Basically, those with technical skills, I'm going to sort of reverse interpret this again. Those with technical skills have to work harder. Essentially, is my takeaway from this. Those with access to management, the social skills, they already had some of that information. So basically, the technical guys have to work harder. Okay, well, this is sort of a big debate that, papers in labor academics are exploring the effect of AI on high-skilled workers. I think you could totally link to this literature. This is sort of consistent with this winners and losers that Ronnie and I are finding, that, those with social skills, those are the ones that are benefiting from AI. We find, we've looked at we matched up to LinkedIn. We're seeing that MBAs, those who have more meetings with managers and all-star investors, those all-star analysts, all of them who you think of as sort of proxies for social skills are the ones who seem to be staying in their job and doing well. And I even have recently done a bunch of interviews with, I did the UBS Intelligence Center that you talk about. I've talked to some guys at Deutsche Bank, different places about how they see, AI big data playing a role. And they've totally told me it's the most hours they've ever had to spend hand-holding with clients. And this was like consistent in all of our interviews of, what they're doing. And it seems to me, and then they also they feel the competition. They know that these outside fintechs are competing with them. And so he kept saying to me, like, you have to have your ear to the street. They are clearly aware of trying to find some unique angle, some trading idea, something that could be alt data. I don't think I have a lot of time. I have some minor points about the sample. I think I understood it better in your presentation. I'd love to see the boldness effort measure. It's one in accounting. I think it's a great one. Short and long-term forecast. So I know in our paper, we didn't see a change in the frequency of forecasts, sort of what you were saying for the proxy of effort, but we did see them shift the percentage of their forecast towards short-term ones at the expense of long-term ones. They're making more short-term relative overall. And then, buy side, you already did a ton, but I thought investors text had buy side too. If you did, it could be a cool falsification. And then just to benchmark, because I think your alt data, there's a lot of people who are trying to use these measures out there. And I'd just be curious if you had it. And I know Cornell has it, the job posting and some of the other proxies people have used. But overall, I really liked your question and project approach. I think the data is super cool. It has a beautiful richness. And, I encourage everybody to read it and think about it. I definitely enjoyed thinking about it.
Okay, thank you very much. Wang, do you want to take some time to respond?
Yeah, sure. No, thank you so much for discussing this paper. We're so happy that the session chair picked you as the discussant, and I'm even happier that you agreed to do it because you're one of the leaders in this field. No, we basically agree with all you say. We should emphasize a little bit more, like what you said, that it's actually not obvious that just because you draw from alternative data, your forecasts become more accurate. It's actually very, very difficult, right? So if you see that, oh, the theme park, it seems busy, how do you actually map that in an actual earnings forecast? It's non-trivial, right? Or sometimes you often get conflicting signals, right? So you see that people are searching your product names more, but at the same time, you see on social media feeds some negative comments being made about your products. So actually interpreting all that vastness of data and mapping it into actual earnings forecasts, that's where the challenge is. So we did actually find it surprising that it does seem to at least associate with more accurate forecasts. So we should emphasize that more.